rose skyward as block after block in the capital city burned with the fires of Viet Cong treachery. As the frightened people
Death. Destruction. This is what American soldiers woke to on the bloodiest time of the Vietnam War. A full-scale attack by the Viet Cong forces was underway. The Viet Cong forces, led by General Vo Nam Giap, attacked over 100 cities in less than a year. There were over 5,000 dead after only the second day. This would later be known as the Tet Offensive. This was the largest military operation by the Vietnam forces in the war. The attack was intended to drive a wedge between South Vietnam and the United States, making America give up its defense in South Vietnam. Although the Tet Offensive resulted in a mass number of deaths for the Communists, it impacted something much greater. During the early hours of January 31st, 1968, the Communist forces of Vietnam launched a series of coordinated attacks which surprised the American and South Vietnamese forces on the sacred holiday of Tet. In Saigon, North Vietnamese forces were able to successfully get into the US Embassy while capturing other targets. However, Vietnamese forces were taken down by the Americans soon after. Meanwhile, the American forces were working to take back Hue from the Viet Cong. The result? A war not on the ground, but in the brain. Although the Tet Offensive was a loss for both, it was clear that the Communist forces ended up with the larger benefits. The hardest and strongest thing to attack in a war is moral and public support. Despite the fact that the number of Viet Cong casualties was greatly increased after the Tet Offensive, the amount of public support of the idea of sending American troops into Vietnam plummeted dramatically. Many anti-war movements were established, from college to cities, and from this, it gave more power to the youth. In the long debate about who won the Tet Offensive, Americans say that the US won the battle, because they had successfully stopped the attack and took down many Viet Cong forces. Although the North Vietnamese captured Saigon and Hue for a short time, the US quickly took both of them back. In that time, many communist soldiers were killed, proving that the offensive was a complete fail for the opposing side. But having the US stop an attack does not make a difference. The US have already stopped many other conflicts in their short history. What makes this one different? Having North Vietnam being able to get a big influence on the enemy sides puts the odds in their favor. A standpoint in a war overpowers a military advantage in this specific case. Eventually, it was because of how the communists manipulated the Americans' public's approval that ended the war in their favor. It is easily debatable that the largest effect of this offensive was America fighting over how to handle the war. But what caused many Americans to suddenly turn against the ambition of continuing the war? In this case, the fear and violence surrounding the Tet Offensive would be the culprit, as some soldiers even resorted to using heroin and marijuana to escape their daily terrors. At the time, many news reporters were in Vietnam, and as a result, the violence of the Tet Offensive was preserved for future generations to witness. In the Tet Offensive, 28,000 Vietnamese lost their lives, which included many innocent people and fighters alike. However, this mass devastation proved inconclusive, as the Tet Offensive did not progress the US in the war, and the only thing that came of it was a long, bloody stalemate. This violence caused a change in America's view forever of the Vietnam War. Additionally, America was not able to handle this well-planned attack from the North Vietnamese. This massive assault against South Vietnam had not only hurt the American opinion, but the overall strategy of the US soldiers. The CIA staff said, although warning was provided, the intensity, coordination, and timing of the enemy attack were not fully anticipated.
We don't have any operation to destroy them. We ceasefire, we stop it. But the communists, they betray, and exactly the first of the 3-day ceasefire at 12 o'clock p.m. a.m. They attack almost the South Vietnam, around 36 provinces and more than 80 districts the same time. They attack the same time.
The Tet Offensive had an important effect on the world and the war. For example, the offensive ended Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency, inspired a movement of anti-war protests, and caused Americans to distrust the government and military. When the Tet Offensive occurred, President Lyndon B. Johnson was running to be re-elected as President of the United States. And at first, Johnson said that the Vietnam War was going to be a very easy win for the US. But the violence shown by many news reporters during the Tet Offensive caused many people to distrust Johnson, since what the Tet Offensive showed was an endless, ruthless stalemate. And due to this, the Johnson administration was greatly affected. Walter Cronkite, one of the most trusted people in America, broadcasted to the US, admitting how to say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic yet unsatisfactory conclusion. This caused a huge blow to not only Americans but Johnson himself. Momentarily after his broadcast, Lyndon B. Johnson had turned to his allies and said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." And this was only the start of his tumbling legacy. He would soon make a message to America, saying that he would not seek another presidency term. In an interview with a Lieutenant Colonel James Wilbanks, he explained to us how it is more about the expectations you build, and the expectations built by Westmoreland and the White House was that we were winning the war. And then suddenly to be attacked by 80,000 troops? That was really the death blow to the credibility of the White House. Additionally, his words to all of us was that the key lesson is you have to be realistic and never build unreasonable expectations among the American public. With the brutal offensive shocking many Americans, a series of anti-war protests sprouted. Before this disastrous event, many people had trusted the government's promise of a clean victory against North Vietnam. However, after discovering the lies Johnson had been informing the Americans, an organization known as Students for Democratic Society started many social movements involving peace with Vietnam and the withdrawal of American soldiers. Because of this, Americans voted candidate Richard Nixon to be the next president. After Nixon was elected, he followed the support of the people and tried to slowly withdraw from the Vietnam War. This created the process known as Vietnamization. Although Nixon had easily won the election, he was oblivious to the great burden left by his predecessor. At first, America was not open to making peace talks with the communists because they believed they had the major advantage to win the war. But the immense amount of violence that occurred during the offensive eventually pushed them to negotiate with the communists on January 27, 1973, creating the Paris Peace Accords. The Paris Peace Accords was a compromise that ended the Vietnam War. It was an agreement between the US, South Vietnam, and North Vietnam. This treaty said that the US would withdraw from the war and that South and North Vietnam would be divided. Although it ended US involvement in the war, it had only temporarily stopped the fighting between the two parts of Vietnam. Overall, the Tet Offensive showed the United States that having the public and government on different sides can be highly unpredictable and dangerous. If it weren't for the Tet Offensive, the course of the war would have been greatly altered. William Westmoreland, a general of the Vietnam War, insisted, "If I would have to do it over again, I would have made known the forthcoming Tet Offensive."